She is sitting almost perfectly still in a high-backed chair, somewhere inside one of her own palaces along the Thames, and she has been sitting still like this for the better part of an hour, while a Netherlandish painter named Antonis Moore works a few feet away in the window light. Mixing lead white and a deep vermilion red on a wooden palette balanced against his forearm. It is the closing weeks of 1554, and Mary Tudor, Queen of England, is holding the pose that will outlive her by nearly 500 years, the pose that hangs today in the Museo del Prado in Madrid, signed and dated in the painter's own hand along the lower edge of the panel. Antonius Moore Pingabat, 1554. She's dressed in a gown of velvet, so dark and so densely dyed that it reads almost black in low light and only reveals its true, deep red in full sun. The fabric heavy enough across the shoulders that a gentlewoman standing just out of the painter's line of sight is ready, at any moment, to step forward and adjust a fold the queen cannot reach herself. Cloth of gold shows at the slashed sleeves in narrow, deliberate lines. A jeweled hood frames a face that has been composed with real and visible effort into an expression of total, unblinking calm, and in her hands folded quietly in her lap, she holds a pair of gloves and a small book, the two objects a queen of this era was expected to be seen holding when a portrait needed to say, without a single spoken word, that this was a woman of piety, restraint, and settled authority. This is the face the 16th century agreed to remember, at least on the continent, since the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, had commissioned this very portrait, so that his son Philip, already married to Mary by proxy that spring, and married to her in person since July, would have an accurate likeness of the wife waiting for him in a country he had not yet visited. It was meant to travel. It was meant to reassure an anxious Spanish court that the marriage alliance holding half of Europe's diplomacy together that year was a settled, dignified, entirely secure arrangement. Every inch of the painting, from the composed hands to the jeweled stillness of the face, was built to project exactly that message. It was not entirely true, or rather, it was true only in the way a finished portrait is always true, which is to say selectively, and only after everything unfinished and frightening had already been cropped out of the frame. Beneath the velvet and the practiced stillness of that painted face is a woman who spent the opening weeks of that same year, 1554, listening for reports of an armed rebellion marching directly toward the gates of her own capital. A woman who watched a 17-year-old cousin she had personally spared from execution the previous autumn go to the block anyway once the political ground shifted under both of their feet, and a woman whose body, in the months just before this portrait was finished, had already produced the first unmistakable signs of an ordeal that would consume the following spring and summer in front of her entire watching court. And standing just outside the edge of the frame, Antonius Moore chose to paint. In that same chamber, on that same afternoon, stood the women who had lived through every hour of it alongside her, close enough to hear her breathing change during a difficult night, and close enough on the wrong day to have been named in the very same interrogations that sent others to the Tower. This is the story of those women, the gentlewomen and ladies who staffed Mary Tudor's privy chamber during the most dangerous winter of her young reign. Women whose names rarely appear in the history most people are taught, and whose daily, exhausting, closely watched service is the real, done and polished machinery sitting underneath the finished portrait. Antonius Moore delivered to Spain in the winter of 1554. This is the winter of 1554. Mary Tudor has been Queen of England for a little under 18 months, the first woman in the country's history to hold the crown in her own right, not as any king's wife, but as a sovereign whose blood alone entitled her to the throne. and she has arrived at that throne only after spending most of her adult life as a bargaining chip in someone else's argument. Declared illegitimate by an act of parliament under her own father, barred from the succession, restored to it only through a chain of deaths and political collapses that nobody, least of all Mary herself, had any reliable way of predicting. She has just announced her intention to marry Philip of Spain, the son of the most powerful monarch in Europe, a foreign Catholic prince whose arrival a significant portion of her own subjects regard as something close to a national humiliation. And the ink is barely dry on that announcement when men begin quietly gathering weapons in the county of Kent. By the final week of January, a former courtier and soldier named Sir Thomas Wyatt the Younger has raised several thousand armed men under the banner of opposing the Spanish marriage, and he is marching them directly toward London. This video is about what it actually felt like to live inside Queen Mary's household during the weeks that followed, when that anger in the countryside turned into an army at the edge of the capital, and her own private bedchamber, the most intimate room in the kingdom, became one of the most closely watched. It is not the Queen's story alone which has already been told, retold, argued over, and eventually flattened into a single ugly nickname that history settled on decades after her death. It is the story of the women who surrounded her, the ladies and gentlewomen of her privy chamber, who dressed her, guarded her most private conversations, prayed beside her through sleepless nights, and understood every one of them. That a single careless sentence or a single wrong glance exchanged during Mass could be the difference between a quiet retirement decades later and a cold morning on Tower Hill. Before we go any further, if the kind of unhurried, carefully sourced history that gets left out of the official portraits is something you find worth your time, take a moment to subscribe. It costs nothing, and it helps this particular kind of research keep getting made. If there is a court, a household, or a single dangerous year you would like to see examine this closely, leave it in a comment. I read every one. There is a simple picture of Mary Tudor's court that gets repeated in documentary after documentary, a grim queen presiding over a parade of burnings, a household frozen under the weight of a nickname she never once heard applied to herself while she was alive. Bloody Mary did not exist as a phrase during her own lifetime. It took shape in the years just after her death, popularized above all by the Protestant printer and martyrologist John Fox, whose acts and monuments turned her 5-year reign into a catalogue of Protestant suffering, written as the winning side of any religious argument tends to write its history from the winning side. The picture built on that book is not wrong exactly, but it is not the whole truth either, and it flattens the real women who lived through this period into background furniture, standing quietly behind a portrait's edge. This is a video about what actually filled their days, the exhausting physical labor of dressing a queen in jeweled velvet heavy enough to require 2 pairs of hands. The nights spent on a hard trundle bed, pulled out from underneath a royal bed frame that never seemed to grow fully still. The dangerous cosmetics some of them were already beginning to use, made from white lead and vinegar, in pursuit of the pale, unblemished complexion the era prized above almost anything else. The machinery of religious suspicion that could turn a hidden prayer book into evidence of treason, and the specific, private terror of watching a former friend, a young woman not yet 17, walk out across the Tower Green to a scaffold within earshot. And underneath all of it, what it actually took for the women who survived these months to master the single most valuable skill anyone could hold at the Tudor court, the art of remaining completely unremarkable while standing at the exact center of the most closely watched household in England. Let us begin then, not with the Queen seated for her portrait, but with the young woman standing just behind her chair, close enough to be trusted with the pins that held the Queen's sleeves in place, and close enough, on the wrong day, to be trusted with nothing at all. Her name is Alice Fenwick, and in January of 1554, she is 23 years old, the daughter of a minor Yorkshire knight named Sir Nicholas Fenwick, whose family held enough land and enough distant connection to the court to secure his daughter, though not nearly enough wealth or standing to make that place secure on its own merits. Alice did not arrive at a glittering court to serve a triumphant new monarch. She arrived years earlier, while Mary was still a princess, living under a cloud of declared illegitimacy at houses like Hunsdon and Hatfield, watched as much as attended by informants her own brother's council had placed inside her diminished household. And Alice learned the actual rules of survival at court during the years when the woman she served had almost nothing, no throne, no certain future, and often no more than a handful of loyal servants willing to risk their own prospects by staying close to her. She has carried those rules forward into the strange, sudden reality of a household that now, against every expectation anyone held 5 years earlier, answers to a reigning queen. The household Alice belongs to has its own careful, largely unspoken hierarchy. At the top sit the great ladies of the Privy Chamber, women like Susan Clarentia, who had entered Mary's service in 1525 as a young maid and never left. Weathering the same disgraces and reversals Mary herself endured, and rising by 1554. With the Queen's most private correspondence, and eventually with the execution of her will. Below women like Clarencieux sit gentlewomen such as Alice herself, gentry-born and trusted with real intimate physical service, dressing the Queen, sitting with her during long afternoons of needlework, taking turns through the night in her chamber, but without the decades of personal friendship that gave a woman like Clarencieux her particular, almost unshakable standing. Below the gentlewomen again sit the chamberers, servants of lower birth, who carry out the household's heavier physical labor. The scrubbing and carrying and emptying that gentlewomen are largely spared. Every layer of that hierarchy is also, quietly, a layer of risk. The higher a woman's position, and the closer her proximity to the Queen's private conversations, the more devastating it becomes if that trust is later found by an interrogator with every incentive to find something to have been misplaced. It was Susan Clarencio who took the newly arrived Alice aside during her first winter in Mary's service and explained, in the plain, practical terms of a woman who had already survived one household dissolution and years of diminished status. Say little. Notice everything. Never let your face show what you actually think during Mass, because someone is always watching to see whether your eyes linger too long or not long enough on the elevation of the host. It was advice Alice has carried with her every day since, through the increasingly strange turns of Mary's fortunes, from disinherited princess to reigning queen to, now, a monarch facing an armed rebellion raised partly against the very marriage she has chosen for herself. Physically, Alice is unremarkable in exactly the way the era required of a gentlewoman meant to be seen and never noticed. A slight woman of middling height, her complexion pale from a diet heavy in bread and light in fresh vegetables through the winter months. Her hands roughened at the knuckles from years of fine needlework, and from the cold water she washes her face with each morning, since heated water is a luxury reserved for the Queen's own basin and not for the women who attend her. She carries a persistent ache low in her back from too many nights spent on a narrow trundle bed, and a chronic redness around her eyes she privately blames on candle smoke and does not mention to anyone, since admitting discomfort at court is itself a small social risk. Gentlewomen are expected to be tireless, and Alice has spent years learning to look tireless, whether or not she actually is. What is expected of her, day to day, is considerable. She rises well before dawn to help prepare the Queen's chamber, assist through the hours-long process of dressing Mary in the layered, jeweled clothing her rank demands, attends her at Mass and at meals, and sits nearby through the long stretches of the afternoon when the Queen reads dispatches or receives ambassadors. Ready to be summoned for anything from fetching a letter to simply providing quiet company during one of the headaches that more and more often that winter leave the Queen unable to bear conversation. When the Queen's private hours finally end each night, Alice and one or two other gentlewomen take turns sleeping in the very same chamber, on trundle beds, drawn out from underneath the royal bed frame, positioned there for a single, deliberate reason, so that the Queen of England is never, for a single hour of the night, left entirely alone. There is one detail about Alice that would not survive in any surviving household account, because no clerk was ever assigned to record it. In the dark, after the Queen has finally fallen asleep, Alice prays quietly and without moving her lips, not for the Queen's health or the success of her coming marriage, which are the prayers she is technically supposed to be saying, but for her own family's safety back in Yorkshire, and for her own survival, specifically, through whatever the coming weeks are about to bring. She has already watched enough of this court's sudden reversals, illness that could take a healthy person within a day, falls from favor that ended careers overnight, to understand, in a way she has never said aloud to anyone, that standing close to a throne is not remotely the same thing as standing somewhere safe. The specific stretch of days framing everything this hour is about to walk through together begins in the last week of January 1554, when word first reaches the court that a gentleman named Sir Thomas Wyatt, a man some of the older ladies in the household remember from more peaceful years, has raised his tenants and neighbours across the county of Kent, and is marching with several thousand armed men behind him directly toward the walls of London. For Alice Fenwick, and for every woman in that bedchamber, the distant, abstract machinery of Tudor politics is about to become something they can hear, quite literally, through the palace walls. If you picture a Tudor lady in waiting at all, you probably picture something close to a decoration, a young woman in fine cloth, trailing a few respectful steps behind her queen, spending her afternoons at embroidery and her evenings at cards, exchanging court gossip in low voices. It is a comfortable image, borrowed mostly from later centuries and from paintings that show ladies in waiting, standing quietly at the edges of grand rooms, present but unburdened, ornamental rather than functional. It is also almost entirely wrong for a woman in Alice Fenwick's position in the winter of 1554, and understanding exactly how wrong it is matters, because the actual daily rhythm of that service explains why gentlewomen at this court were by any reasonable modern standard chronically and quietly exhausted. The actual reality of gentlewomen's service in a Tudor Queen's privy chamber was closer to shift work than to companionship, structured around a single, non-negotiable requirement that the Queen of England was never, at any hour of the day or night, to be left alone, unattended. This requirement was not a courtesy. It was a matter of security, of dignity, and of plain physical necessity in an age with no reliable way to summon help quickly if a monarch fell ill, went into labor, or, in a winter like this one, faced the possibility of an intruder. Household ordinances governing royal service, the same kind of detailed regulations that had earlier restructured Henry VIII's own privy chamber under Cardinal Wolsey, specified exactly this kind of continuous coverage for a monarch person, and Mary's own household, though smaller and less lavishly funded than her father's had been, operated under the identical assumption: someone was always awake, or at least always present, in the Queen's chamber. That someone rotated in shifts among a small handful of trusted women, and during the winter of 1554, as fear of the rebellion sharpened by the week, the rotation tightened rather than relaxed. The physical arrangement itself was almost aggressively unglamorous. A trundle bed, a low-wheeled frame, small enough to be pushed entirely beneath the Queen's own bedstead during the day and pulled out again each night, gave the attending gentlewoman a place to sleep that was by design close enough to reach the queen within seconds and low enough to make clear, without anyone needing to say it aloud, exactly whose comfort the room's furniture existed to serve. The mattress was thinner than the queen's own, the linen plainer, and the space underneath the great bed frame often held years of accumulated dust and draught that no amount of careful housekeeping fully eliminated, since nobody was assigned to clean a space that spent most of its existence hidden from view. A gentlewoman sleeping there felt every change in the room's temperature more sharply than the queen did herself, since the queen's own bed carried heavier hangings and thicker coverlets, while the trundle bed underneath it caught whatever draught came under the door or through the shuttered window. And a woman lying awake on one of these frames through a January night in 1554 had ample opportunity to feel every degree of cold the palace's old stone walls let in. For Alice, the physical toll of these nights had become, over several years, a kind of low background weather he had stopped consciously noticing. Her back ached most mornings in a specific familiar place just above the hip, the direct result of years spent curling onto a mattress too narrow to allow her to stretch out fully, and she had trained herself to wake at the smallest change in the queen's breathing. A skill that had become so automatic it now woke her during the rare nights she slept in her own family's house in Yorkshire, jolting her upright at sounds that meant nothing at all outside a royal bedchamber. During the tense weeks of Wyatt's approach toward London, this training intensified into something closer to genuine vigilance rather than habit. Alice found herself lying rigid on the trundle bed for long stretches after the queen's breathing had finally settled into sleep, straining to hear anything moving in the corridor outside, since rumors already circulating through the household that January suggested the rebels' aims extended well past a simple protest against the Spanish marriage. And nobody serving at the queen's bedside that winter was entirely certain what an armed man reaching that chamber in the middle of the night might actually intend to do. The broader context here corrects a persistent and quite understandable modern assumption: the idea that proximity to royal power in this era meant comfort, or at minimum, meant physical ease purchased through status, even where genuine safety could not be guaranteed. The historian Ruth Goodman, whose work reconstructing the daily physical realities of earlier English life has become a standard reference for exactly this kind of question, has observed that service in a great household at any level functioned as continuous labor with almost no true rest built into it. Since even sleep itself was a duty rather than a private retreat for anyone positioned close enough to a monarch's person to be needed at a moment's notice. Mary's own household accounts from these years, smaller and more carefully managed than her father's had been during his extravagant decades on the throne, show a queen whose privy chamber ran on a notably tight rotation of trusted women, which meant that each individual gentlewoman like Alice carried a heavier, more frequent burden of night duty than she might have carried in a wealthier or more lavishly staffed household. The historian Anna Whitelock, in her biography of Mary's reign, has described the Queen's privy chamber during exactly this period as a strikingly intimate space, small enough that every woman inside it knew precisely how much the Queen was or was not sleeping, precisely how her moods shifted with the news arriving from Kent, and precisely how much strain the entire household was quietly absorbing on her behalf. There is a quiet observation worth carrying forward from this particular chapter of Alice's service into everything that follows. The women who slept nearest to Mary Tudor were not decorative fixtures enjoying an easy proximity to power. They were doing something closer to continuous unpaid emergency service night after night on furniture built explicitly to remind them of their place in the household's hierarchy, and they were doing it that winter with the added, entirely reasonable fear that the danger approaching the palace might not stop politely at the outer walls. Rank at this court brought a woman closeness to the throne. It did not buy her a full night's sleep, and in the winter of 1554, it did not buy her any particular certainty that the morning would arrive without incident. Which brings us to a second, related discomfort that filled Alice Fenwick's days just as thoroughly as the exhaustion of her nights, because sleep was only one half of what her body was being asked to endure that winter. The other half arrived each morning, the moment the Queen woke, and the actual work of turning Mary Tudor into a reigning monarch, visible and correct in front of ambassadors, councillors, and an increasingly anxious court, began in earnest. If you picture the process of dressing a Tudor queen, you probably picture something brisk and dignified, a gown lifted over the head, few laces drawn tight at the back, perhaps a single attendant fastening a final clasp before the Queen sweeps off to whatever business the day holds. It is the version of royal dressing that survives in most costume dramas, compressed into a minute or two of screen time, because a full and accurate rendering would simply take too long to film. The actual process, the one Alice Fenwick and 2 or 3 other gentlewomen performed together most mornings of that winter, bore almost no resemblance to that brisk, dignified version, and took considerably longer than any modern viewer would sit still for. The actual work began with the smock, a plain linen undergarment worn directly against the skin, the one piece of the entire ensemble meant to touch the Queen's body rather than sit over another layer of fabric, since linen next to skin was understood, in the same medical logic that shaped every Tudor household's approach to hygiene, to draw sweat and oil away from the body far better than wool or silk ever could. Over the smock came a boned bodice stiffened with strips of whalebone or reed sewn into narrow channels designed to shape the torso into the smooth, columnar silhouette. The era considered correct for a queen, and already at this second layer, the process required real physical cooperation, since a properly fitted bodice had to be laced tightly enough to hold its shape without loosening throughout a long day, and lacing it correctly meant one gentlewoman bracing a knee gently against the Queen's back while pulling the laces taut, an intimate, effortful posture that no formal portrait of the era ever depicts. Underneath the outer skirts, at a farthingale, a hooped underskirt of Spanish design, its graduated rings of whalebone or heavy cord holding the gown's eventual shape away from the legs. A fashion that had travelled to the English court originally through Catherine of Aragon decades earlier, and had taken on fresh relevance now that a Spanish prince was about to become Mary's husband. Over all of this came the kirtle, a fitted underdress often visible at the front through a split in the outer gown, followed finally by the gown itself. Its sleeves, frequently a separate piece, entirely pinned into place at the shoulder, rather than sewn permanently, so that a single gown's sleeves could be swapped for a different pair, depending on the occasion. A construction detail that meant the pins holding Mary's sleeves in place each morning were being placed fresh, by hand, every single day. Jewels came last, and they came in genuine quantity for an occasion of any importance, sewn directly into the fabric of the bodice and sleeves in some cases, pinned as separate ornaments in others, a hood arranged over carefully dressed hair and secured with its own set of pins. Quote, rings fitted onto fingers that had been washed and dried specifically for the purpose. Each pin, each lacing point, each jewel required a decision about placement and a pair of steady hands to execute it, and a queen dressing for an appearance before ambassadors or council members, rather than for a quiet morning of private business, might occupy 3 or 4 gentlewomen simultaneously for the better part of 2 hours. Working in careful coordination around a woman who was, throughout the entire process, expected to remain still, composed, and available to receive early messages or brief visitors, even as the work continued around her. For Alice, whose specific responsibility that winter generally centered on the sleeves and the smaller jewels, the labor was less dramatic than exacting. Hours spent standing rather than sitting, arms raised and steady for long stretches at a time, fingers working pins through heavy fabric without ever catching the queen's skin. A skill that had taken years to develop, and that punished the smallest lapse in concentration with a pricked fingertip she learned to absorb without any visible reaction. The emotional weight of the work that particular winter sat heavier than the physical labor itself. Alice was dressing a queen who increasingly received the morning's first dispatches while still half-dressed. Since news from Kent could not wait for the ceremony of full formal attire to be completed, and more than once that January she found herself pinning a sleeve into place while Mary read a report in silence a few feet away, her face working to remain composed for the benefit of the women around her, even as the content of the letter plainly troubled her. Dressing a queen, Alice had come to understand, was not simply a matter of appearance. It was an act performed in the middle of whatever crisis happened to be unfolding that morning, requiring the same steady hands and unreadable expression from the women doing the dressing that the queen herself was expected to maintain once the doors opened. The broader context surrounding this labor connects directly to what historians of Tudor costume, among them Janet Arnold, whose detailed reconstructions of surviving 16th century garments have shaped much of what is now understood, yet found in surviving inventories and construction techniques from the period. Tudor garments of this rank were assembled rather than simply put on, built daily from separate interchangeable components, pinned and laced into a finished whole, that had to be at least partially disassembled again each evening, which meant the labor Alice performed each morning was mirrored by an equivalent labor each night, unpinning, unlacing, and carefully storing each piece for reuse. Sumptuary laws of the period, which regulated exactly which fabrics, furs, and colors different ranks of English society were legally permitted to wear, made the visible richness of a queen's gown into something closer to a coded public statement than a simple matter of taste, meaning that every choice Alice and her fellow gentlewomen helped execute each morning, which jewels, which sleeves, which particular shade of velvet, carried a deliberate political weight that a modern viewer glancing at a finished portrait. Surviving wardrobe accounts from Mary's reign, the detailed household records kept by the officers responsible for tracking every gown, jewel, and length of fabric that passed through the royal wardrobe, give historians today an unusually precise window into exactly how much material and labor a single formal appearance actually required. Listing individual gowns by their fabric, their trimmings, and the specific occasions they were altered or refitted for reuse. Since even a queen's wardrobe operated on a logic of careful reuse and adaptation, a gown recorded one year might reappear the next, with its sleeves replaced, its jewels reset into a different arrangement, or its trim exchanged for something more current, each alteration requiring its own round of exacting needlework, performed by gentlewomen and household tailors. For Alice, this meant that no single morning's dressing ever felt entirely routine, since even a gown she had helped assemble a dozen times before might arrive from storage that week, bearing some small, specified change she had to learn and execute correctly on her very first attempt, with the Queen herself standing ready to notice immediately if a familiar garment suddenly felt wrong against her body. There is something worth pausing on in the fact that the very stillness a portrait like Antonis More's captures, the composed hands, the unmoving jeweled hood, required an entire invisible choreography of other people's hands to produce, hands that had to work quickly, precisely, and without complaint, through a process that left the Queen looking effortlessly regal, and left the women performing that labor with sore arms, pricked fingers, and that particular winter, the added strain of watching their Queen absorb difficult news while still half assembled for the day ahead. The performance of royal composure was in the most literal sense built by other people's exhaustion. And critically, this was understood by everyone inside that chamber as simply how the work was done. An arrangement so completely normal to the women performing it that none of them would have thought to describe their own aching shoulders as anything worth remarking on. Close your eyes for a moment and picture the particular shade of pale the 16th century considered beautiful because the image most people reach for, a face powdered to the whiteness of porcelain, lips and cheeks painted in a bright unnatural red, belongs mostly to a later decade than the one this hour is examining. That iconic, almost mask-like look, Elizabeth's, developed and exaggerated across the final decades of the century and projecting it backward onto every Tudor court a generation earlier, flattens a story that was, in the winter of 1554, still very much in its early and uneven stages. The actual picture is that the ingredients and the underlying obsession were already present at Mary's court. Circulating through translated continental manuscripts, apothecary knowledge, and the general influence of Spanish and Italian fashion that had followed Catherine of Aragon into England decades earlier, and had only strengthened with a Spanish marriage now on the horizon. Even if the finished look had not yet hardened into the single recognizable style it would become under Mary's half-sister. Venetian ceruse, a paste made from white lead dissolved in vinegar, was already known in England by name, imported from Venice at real expense, and applied to whiten the complexion, cover the small blemishes and pockmarks that a life without reliable medicine left on almost every face by adulthood, and signal, above almost anything else, that the woman wearing it had no need to labor outdoors under an open sun. A tanned or ruddy face read, to this court, as a laborer's face. A pale one read as gentle birth, and the paler the better, which meant that any woman with the means to afford imported white lead, the genuine social incentive to use it, whatever the private cost to her own skin. Alongside ceruse, some households possessed cosmetic waters made with mercury sublimate, prized for a similar whitening effect, and occasionally used as a treatment for the same blemishes ceruse was meant to hide, and cinnabar, a mineral rich in mercury, provided the bright red pigment used to color lips and cheeks in the absence of safer plant-based alternatives like crushed alkanet root or imported cochineal, both of which the more cautious households favored, specifically because they carried none of the metallic danger of cinnabar. For a young, unmarried gentlewoman at this court, competing quietly for a favorable marriage, a household where a good match depended heavily on catching the right eye at the right moment, the temptation to reach for these preparations carried real weight. And Alice had watched more than one of the younger maids of honor in Mary's household experiment cautiously with a thin application of ceruse before an important audience, dabbing it along the jaw and throat, where season indoors had left the skin sallow rather than truly pale. Alice herself used it rarely, a small pot kept at the bottom of a chest and reserved for the coldest, greyest weeks of winter when her own complexion looked, to her critical eye, closer to illness than to the fashionable pallor she was meant to project, and she had noticed, without fully understanding why, that her skin seemed to redden and flake slightly in the days after. Each user reaction she blamed on the cold rather than on the substance she had just applied to her own face. The Queen herself, by most contemporary accounts, showed considerably less interest in heavy cosmetic use than many of the younger women around her, favoring a plainer, more austere presentation that suited both her personal temperament and the pious, restrained image her supporters worked hard to project during a reign already contested on religious grounds, though even Mary was not entirely exempt from the era's broader preoccupation with a smooth, untroubled complexion, particularly as the strain of that winter's crisis began visibly to show on her face. The broader context here reveals a vicious cycle sitting underneath the era's pursuit of a flawless face. one that historians studying the toxicology of early modern cosmetics have traced with some precision. Lead absorbed through repeated skin contact accumulates in the body over time, producing, with sustained use, exactly the symptoms most likely to make a woman reach for more of the same remedy rather than less. Hair thinning at the crown and brow, skin that dulls and discolors between applications. Sunken pallor and hair loss that later observers would associate most famously with Elizabeth's own aging face by the end of her reign. A woman noticing these early symptoms in the 16th century had no way of connecting them to the very cosmetics she was using to disguise them. And so the sensible, era-appropriate response to worsening skin was simply a heavier hand with the next application, a cycle that could, on the surface and to any casual observer, to be solving the exact problem it was actually causing. Mercury carried its own separate and equally serious risks, capable of causing tremors, memory disturbance, and damage to the kidneys and nervous system with sustained exposure. Dangers entirely invisible to a household, with no concept of what the metal was actually doing once it passed through the skin and into the bloodstream. There is a quiet observation worth sitting with here, before this hour moves on to the next demand this court placed on the women serving inside it. The women reaching for a small pot of imported white lead in the winter of 1554 were not vain in any simple dismissible sense. They were responding, with the tools their century actually offered them, to a brutal calculation about how a woman's future, her marriage, her standing, her entire economic security could hinge on how her face read to the people with the power to arrange that future for her. The logic was practical, however dangerous its actual mechanics turned out to be. And the women applying that paste to their own skin each morning had no way of knowing they were trading a visible temporary blemish for a slower, less visible one. On the 1st of February, 1554, Queen Mary did something her own council had spent the better part of 3 days begging her not to do. Rather than withdraw to the greater safety of Windsor Castle, well outside the city and its unpredictable crowds, she rode into the heart of London itself, to the Guildhall, and stood before the assembled citizens of a capital that a rebel army was actively marching toward, to ask them in person to defend her. If you picture Wyatt's rebellion at all, probably picture it as a somewhat distant military affair, soldiers maneuvering somewhere out in the Kent countryside, while the Queen and her household waited safely behind palace walls for news to arrive by messenger. Largely insulated from any real physical danger until the whole business resolved itself one way or another, the actual sequence of events gives that comfortable distance no support whatsoever. Word had reached the court by the final days of January that Sir Thomas Wyatt had raised several thousand men in Kent under the banner of opposing the Queen's marriage to Philip of Spain, and by the 30th of January, Mary's own councillors, truly afraid for her safety, urged her repeatedly to leave the capital altogether. She refused, and on the 1st of February she rode to the Guildhall and delivered a speech that historians studying her reign consistently identify as the single most consequential act of her entire time as Queen. What she actually said, preserved in more than one contemporary account, reminded the citizens of London that she was their true and lawful queen, her father's daughter, wedded, as she put it, to the realm and its laws rather than to any single man. And she promised that if her council could not persuade her that the Spanish marriage truly served her subjects good, she would abandon the match herself rather than force it upon a resisting people. It was a calculated, deeply personal appeal, delivered by a woman standing entirely alone in front of a hostile and frightened crowd, with no guarantee whatsoever that they would choose to protect her over a rebel army. By the following morning, more than 20,000 men had enrolled themselves for the city's defense. The historian David Lodes, whose work on Mary's reign remains a standard reference for this period, has argued that the Guildhall speech represents the precise moment Mary's reign stopped being a fragile, contested arrangement and became, at least for the citizens of London, one through nothing but her own presence and her own words at the exact moment she most needed them to work. For the women inside Mary's household, the days that followed the speech were not an abstract waiting game conducted from a comfortable remove. Wyatt reached Southwark, directly across the river from the city, by the 3rd of February, only to find London Bridge itself barricaded and defended too heavily to force a crossing. Turned his forces upriver toward Kingston instead, crossed the Thames there on the 6th of February, and by the following morning was marching his men back toward London along its western approaches, close enough that fighting broke out at Charing Cross and pushed as far as Ludgate itself before the city's defences. And the failure of any expected uprising inside London to actually materialise on Wyatt's behalf finally broke his advance apart. For Alice Fenwick and the other gentlewomen inside the Queen's household during those particular days, the information arriving from outside the palace walls came in an unsteady, frightening stream of messengers, some reporting the rebels turned back, others reporting them advancing, the contradictions themselves a kind of torment. Since nobody inside that chamber could be entirely certain, hour to hour, whether the army approaching London intended simply to force a political concession or something considerably more drastic aimed directly at the Queen herself. Alice remembers the specific quality of those days as a kind of controlled, unspoken dread that ran through every task the household continued to perform, regardless of the danger outside, since a queen still needed dressing, still needed her meals prepared, even as messengers rode in and out of the palace gates at all hours, carrying news that could, depending on which hour's rumour happened to be true, mean the household's continued safety or its sudden and violent disruption. The palace gates themselves were more heavily guarded than Alice had ever seen them. Household men who ordinarily performed entirely ceremonial duties now standing with real weapons in visibly tense postures, and more than one of the older gentlewomen quietly arranged for small portable valuables to be kept close at hand. Not spoken about directly, but understood by everyone in the room as a precaution against the possibility of needing to leave at very short notice. Alice herself kept a small bundle of her mother's letters and a single silver ring tucked inside her own trunk that week, a private, unremarked gesture of the same instinct, the quiet management of a fear nobody in that chamber wanted to name aloud in front of the Queen herself, who needed more than anything else that week. Women around her who appeared calm regardless of what they actually felt. The broader context surrounding these few days reveals just how uncertain Mary's position actually was, a fact easy to lose given how thoroughly the rebellion's ultimate failure has been absorbed into a tidy historical narrative in hindsight. The historian Judith Richards, in her biography, reassessing Mary's reign away from the flattened caricature later centuries attached to her, has argued that the rebellion came considerably closer to succeeding than most popular accounts acknowledge, and that Mary's personal decision to remain in London, rather than retreating to safety and trusting her council to manage the crisis on her behalf, was very likely the single factor that determined the rebellion's outcome. Wyatt's forces were ultimately turned back at the city's own defences on the 7th of February, his advance collapsing once it became clear that the popular uprising inside London he and his fellow conspirators had counted on was simply not going to materialize, and his surrender followed within hours. The human cost that followed was severe and immediate, with roughly 90 of the captured rebels ultimately hanged across London and its surrounding towns as a deliberate, visible warning to anyone who might consider a similar rebellion in the future. Gallows erected at prominent public locations specifically, so that the punishment could not be missed by anyone passing through the city in the weeks that followed. There is a quiet observation worth carrying forward from these particular days into everything that came after them for the women in Mary's household. The rebellion's defeat did not simply restore the household to its previous calm. It opened an entirely new and, for several of the Queen's own relations and former companions, considerably more dangerous chapter, since a foiled rebellion required its architects and its perceived beneficiaries to answer for it. And among those now facing that reckoning was a young woman several of Mary's own gentlewomen had known personally. Palmer Queen for 9 brief days the previous summer, currently held prisoner in the Tower of London, and until the rebellion's collapse, widely believed to be safe from execution. If you picture the return of Catholic worship under Mary Tudor, you probably picture something close to a quiet homecoming, a country simply reverting to the religious practice it had followed for generations before Mary's father broke with Rome. With most ordinary people accepting the change the same way they might accept a shift in fashion or a change of monarch, without any particular personal risk attached to going along with it. That picture badly understates just how disorienting England's religious whiplash had actually become by 1554. And it badly understates the very real danger that whiplash created for anyone standing close enough to the throne to be watched. The actual situation facing Alice and every other woman in Mary's household was considerably more precarious than simple conformity. England had swung from the Catholic worship of Mary's father's earlier reign to the aggressively reformed Protestantism pushed through under her young brother Edward, and now back to Catholic practice under Mary herself, all within roughly 2 decades, which meant that a woman in her 20s in 1554 had likely spent her most formative years being taught, by the full authority of church and crown, that the Mass Alice now attended every single day was itself a form of idolatry, only to be told a few years later, under an equally absolute royal authority, that abandoning it had been the true heresy all along. Genuine belief, for many people at court, had not simply flipped obediently with each proclamation. It had fractured or hardened into private conviction that outward conformity now had to disguise, and the gentlewomen attending Mass beside Mary Tudor each morning were watched carefully and continuously for exactly the kind of small physical tell that might reveal which of those 2 positions a woman actually held in her heart. A hesitation before kneeling at the elevation of the host, eyes that lingered too long or moved away too quickly at the crucial moment of the service. A crossing gesture performed a half-second out of rhythm with the women kneeling nearby. Every one of these tiny physical details carried genuine interpretive weight in a household where sincerity of faith had become, almost overnight, a matter of political survival rather than private conscience. The atmosphere sharpened considerably once the rebellion's aftermath began implicating people well beyond Wyatt's own circle of conspirators, and nowhere did that sharpening land closer to Mary's own household than in the arrest of her half-sister. Princess Elizabeth, 20 years old that winter and widely regarded by reform-minded English Protestants as their best remaining hope for the succession, was summoned to court under guard in February, questioned repeatedly about any knowledge of or involvement in Wyatt's plans, and ultimately sent to the Tower of London on the 18th of March, entering, according to tradition, through the Watergate later associated with prisoners whose fate remained genuinely uncertain. The evidence actually connecting Elizabeth to the rebellion was thin by the standards later historians have applied to it, resting largely on an intercepted letter and Wyatt's own confession under interrogation, a confession he reportedly withdrew or softened. Who has written extensively on the Tudor succession crisis of these years, have argued that Mary's council pursued the case against Elizabeth as much from political fear and factional pressure as from any solid proof of her actual guilt. For the women serving in Mary's own household, the arrest of a royal princess on suspicion of treason sent an unmistakable signal about just how far this atmosphere of suspicion could reach, since if the Queen's own sister could be summoned, questioned, and imprisoned on evidence, no gentlewoman of modest gentry birth could reasonably assume her own household connections, her own family's past sympathies, or her own private conversations could escape similar scrutiny. For Alice personally, that winter carried a particular private anxiety she confided to no one at court. Her own younger brother, still living in the family household in Yorkshire, had spent several years as a boy being educated under a tutor with openly reformist sympathies, a common enough arrangement during Edward's short reign when such tutors were the fashionable and officially encouraged choice for a gentry family, and Alice had no real way of knowing from her position at court whether that old connection might resurface as a liability if anyone ever thought to look closely at her own family's recent history. She had taken to keeping her own few personal papers, a handful of letters, and a small commonplace book in which she had, years earlier, copied out several English psalms in the plainer, Reformed translation, favoured under Edward's church, hidden inside a loose board under the floor of the small chamber she shared with another gentlewoman. Wrapped in oiled cloth against the damp, and checked only when she was entirely certain of being alone, she was hardly unusual in this. Household inventories and later historical accounts of the period describe exactly this kind of concealment as a widespread and practical response to England's repeated religious reversals. Ordinary families on both sides of the religious divide learning, across successive reigns, and personal writings hidden beneath floorboards, inside wall cavities, or buried in gardens, ready to be recovered or permanently abandoned depending on which way the political wind was currently blowing. The broader context surrounding this atmosphere of religious suspicion helps explain why the danger felt as constant and as inescapable as it did to the women living inside it. Parliament had not yet formally revived the old medieval heresy statutes at the start of 1554. That step would not be completed until the final weeks of the year, with the first burnings following in February of 1555. But the debate over doing exactly that was already actively underway in the same parliamentary session meeting throughout that tense spring, which meant that everyone at court could sense, well before any formal law passed, the direction events were plainly heading. The historian Eamon Duffy, whose scholarship on English religious practice during this period has reshaped much of how historians now understand the Marian Restoration, has emphasized that outward conformity at Mass functioned for a great many English people as a kind of enforced public performance rather than a genuine reflection of settled belief. A performance every single person in that chapel was executing simultaneously, while privately uncertain how many of the people kneeling beside them actually meant it. There is a quiet observation worth sitting with here. Before this hour turns to a danger considerably more immediate than suspicion alone. Faith, in any ordinary understanding of the word, is meant to be a private matter between a person and whatever they hold sacred. At Mary Tudor's court in 1554, it had become instead a constant, exhausting public performance, rehearsed and monitored at every single service, in a household where the wrong gesture at the wrong moment could travel from a whispered observation to a formal interrogation. Burlier. If you picture the fasting rules of a restored Catholic court, you probably picture something close to a mild symbolic gesture, wealthy household simply setting meat aside for a day or two out of religious observance while otherwise eating as comfortably as its resources allowed. The actual discipline reimposed on Mary's household in the early months of 1554 asked for considerably more than a symbolic gesture, and it arrived at one of the worst possible moments for a household already running on exhaustion and fear. Lent that year began in the second week of February, within days of Wyatt's forces breaking apart at the gates of London, which meant that a household still recovering from weeks of acute terror, disrupted sleep, and constant vigilance now faced the additional physical demand of a truly strict fast. One full meal a day for much of the season by the letter of church teaching, meat set aside entirely in favor of fish, and the older, stricter rhythm of ember days and weekly abstinence that Edward's Protestant reformers had spent the previous reign quietly relaxing across the kingdom. Mary's own royal injunctions that year worked to restore this older discipline in full, not merely as private piety, but as public policy, and a household serving a queen determined to model exact religious observance for the entire kingdom had no realistic room to interpret the rules loosely on its own behalf. The fish itself, in a household this far from the coast for much of the year, often arrived salted or dried rather than fresh, a monotonous, sometimes unpleasant staple that offered considerably less sustaining nourishment than the meat it replaced. And a diet built around it for weeks at a stretch left even well-provisioned bodies running on noticeably less than they were accustomed to. For Alice, that particular Lent landed with a specific physical cruelty that she never once complained about aloud, since complaining about her religious observance the Queen herself kept with visible devotion would have read in that household as something considerably worse than simple grumbling. She managed her long days of standing, dressing, and careful vigilance on a noticeably lighter stomach than usual, and more than once that season she felt the particular swimming lightheadedness of real hunger during a long stretch of Mass or a lengthy afternoon of needlework. A sensation she learned to manage by shifting her weight quietly and breathing slowly until it passed rather than risk drawing attention to herself. Mary herself, whose chronic headaches and fragile constitution this hour has already described at length, kept the fast with the same rigor she expected of everyone around her. And Alice noticed, without ever remarking on it to anyone, that the Queen's headache seemed to worsen rather than ease during the strictest weeks of Lent. A pattern nobody in that household would have dared connect openly to the fasting itself. The broader context surrounding this reimposed discipline reveals a dimension of Tudor fasting law that had almost nothing to do with private piety alone. English fish days served a deliberate economic function as well as a religious one, propping up a coastal fishing industry that had suffered under the more relaxed dietary rules of Edward's reign, and later Elizabethan legislation would make this economic motive explicit, describing certain fast days outright as intended for the maintenance of shipping and fishing communities rather than purely spiritual benefit. Mary's restoration of stricter observance in 1554 sat at the early edge of this same policy logic, a religious discipline that also happened to serve the Crown's economic interest in a healthy fishing fleet. Even as the women actually keeping the fast inside the palace experienced it as nothing more abstract than an empty stomach and a long day still ahead of them. Lent was only the longest of these observances, not the only one. The older liturgical calendar, Mary's household, restored in full, also revived the quarterly ember days, 3 consecutive days of fasting near the start of each season, along with the ordinary weekly abstinence expected on Fridays and Saturdays throughout the year. Which meant that a household steward planning the Queen's table had to work from a religious calendar as carefully as any cook works from a market's seasonal supply, tracking which days demanded fish, which permitted eggs and dairy, and which allowed the household's more ordinary fare. Kitchen staff, several ranks below Alice in the household's hierarchy, absorbed a considerable share of the difficulty this created, since a queen's kitchen was expected to produce dishes elegant enough for royal presentation from a noticeably narrower set of ingredients on fast days. Salted and fresh fish, prepared in as many varied and appealing forms as a cook's skill allowed, precisely because a monotonous, visibly poor table would have reflected badly on the household's piety, rather than simply its resourcefulness. The burden of fasting, in other words, did not fall evenly, even within the household itself. It pressed hardest on the women closest to the Queen's own body, who absorbed the physical cost of an empty stomach directly, and on the kitchen staff furthest from her presence, who absorbed the considerable labor of disguising that same scarcity behind a presentation fit for a monarch determined to model devotion. There is a quiet observation worth sitting with here, before this hour turns to a very different kind of physical toll altogether. The body, once again, absorbed what the era's larger machinery of religion and economics required of it, and did so silently, since a hungry gentlewoman swaying slightly during a long mass had no acceptable way to name what she was actually feeling without seeming to complain about the very faith she was there to demonstrate. Piety and physical endurance had become, for the length of that Lent, almost the same discipline, practiced daily and practiced without comment. If you picture a Tudor queen's private health struggles at all, you probably picture them handled with total seamless discretion. A monarch's body considered so far above ordinary concern that even the women dressing her each morning would have been shielded from anything beyond the most polished public version. The actual experience of serving in Mary's bedchamber gives that comfortable assumption almost no room to survive, since a gentlewoman sleeping on a trundle bed a few feet from the Queen's own pillow was, by simple physical proximity, present for every headache, every sleepless night, whether the household's official records ever chose to mention it or not. Mary Tudor's health had been a subject of quiet concern among the diplomats and physicians who observed her for years before she ever became queen. Contemporary reports reaching foreign courts during her 20s and 30s, including dispatches from the imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis, who maintained close and sympathetic contact with Mary throughout the difficult years of her exclusion from the succession, described a young woman troubled by irregular and often painful menstruation, by recurring headaches severe enough to leave her unable to bear light or noise for days at a stretch, and by extended periods of what contemporaries described simply as melancholy, a low, persistent unhappiness that modern observers might recognize as something closer to clinical depression. These were not passing complaints. They were a lifelong pattern, present through the years of her disinheritance under her father, through the harder years of her exclusion under her brother's Protestant council, and still present, unmistakably, in the winter of 1554, when the added strain of an armed rebellion at her own capital's gates pushed an already fragile constitution considerably further. For Alice and the other gentlewomen attending her that winter, the Queen's headaches became a recognizable, almost weather-like pattern to work around. Days when the shutters had to stay closed against the light, when conversation in the chamber dropped to a bare whisper, which she deeply enjoyed and had trained in from childhood, had to be set aside because the sound itself became unbearable to her. Alice learned to read the earliest signs, a particular tightness around the Queen's eyes, a shortness in her replies that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with pain she was working hard not to show, and she learned, as every gentlewoman in that chamber eventually learned, to move through the Queen's private apartments during these episodes with the careful, near-silent efficiency of someone tending a truly ill person, rather than simply attending a monarch having a difficult day. The rebellion's arrival made these episodes considerably more frequent that particular winter, the combination of political terror and physical strain proving, unsurprisingly, to worsen a pattern that had troubled Mary for the better part of 2 decades already. As that dangerous winter finally gave way to spring, and spring gave way to the summer of Mary's actual wedding to Philip in July, the household's attention shifted from crisis management toward a different, and for a time, genuinely hopeful preoccupation. By November of 1554, Mary believed herself pregnant, and the entire court, Alice included, invested that pregnancy with an almost unbearable weight of political and religious significance, since a healthy Catholic heir would secure everything Mary had worked for, and a clear line of succession that would keep the Protestant-leaning Elizabeth permanently away from the throne. The signs Mary and her physicians identified that winter, a halted monthly cycle, a swelling abdomen, and what she described as the unmistakable movement of a child, read at the time as entirely convincing evidence of a genuine pregnancy, and preparations proceeded accordingly, a nursery arranged, physicians and midwives summoned to Hampton Court. Prayers of thanksgiving offered publicly across the kingdom. For the gentlewomen closest to the Queen that winter and into the following spring, the growing uncertainty around this pregnancy became one of the strangest and quietly most distressing experiences of the entire period, since Alice and her fellow attendants were positioned to notice, well before anyone at court would have dared say it aloud, that the Queen's condition was not behaving the way every other successful pregnancy any of them had witnessed in their own families had behaved. The expected date passed in early May without any sign of labor. Weeks stretched into months, and the abdomen that had seemed, in November, to promise an heir within a handful of months, instead simply persisted unchanged, long past any point a normal pregnancy could plausibly continue. Modern researchers examining this episode, among them the physician and historian Milo Keynes, have proposed that Mary's symptoms across this period, and indeed across much of her adult life, may be best explained by a hormonal disorder, possibly a pituitary tumor producing the kind of imbalance that could plausibly account for irregular cycles, headaches, weight fluctuation, and the specific physical and psychological symptoms that led both Mary and her own physicians to believe, in genuine good faith, that a real pregnancy was underway. Historians studying this case now generally regard it as among the earliest well-documented instances of what modern medicine calls pseudokisis, a phantom pregnancy in which the body itself produces many of the physical signs of gestation in response to an overwhelming psychological need for the pregnancy to be real. The broader context surrounding this ordeal matters enormously for how the women who witnessed it firsthand ought to be remembered alongside the Queen they served. The historian Judith Richards has argued that this entire episode deserves to be read with genuine sympathy, rather than the mockery later, more hostile accounts sometimes apply to it, since Mary was, by every available measure, a woman whose own body had betrayed her hopes at the exact moment. The entire stability of her reign depended on the opposite outcome, and the physicians attending her, working entirely within the medical understanding available to their century, had no more reliable way of distinguishing a false pregnancy from a genuine one. For Alice, watching this slow, humiliating unraveling play out in the Queen's own private chamber, the experience left a mark considerably different from the acute terror of the rebellion months earlier. A quieter, more sustained grief on the Queen's behalf that Alice was, of course, never permitted to express openly, since, even in the Queen's most private disappointment, the gentlewomen surrounding her were expected to maintain the same careful, unreadable calm the entire household had learned to perform since the earliest days of the rebellion. There is a quiet observation worth carrying forward from this particular ordeal into everything else this hour has already described. Queen's body, in this era, was never permitted to belong entirely to herself. It belonged to the dynasty, to the religious settlement, to the anxious hopes of an entire kingdom watching for the smallest sign that an heir might finally be coming. And when that body failed to deliver what everyone had been praying for, the women closest to it absorbed a portion of that disappointment too, without any acknowledgement that their own private grief on the Queen's behalf was itself a real and considerable weight to carry. If you picture the execution of Lady Jane Grey at all, you probably picture it as a distant tragedy, a political event that happened somewhere else, to someone the Queen's own household knew mainly by reputation, rather than by any real personal connection. The actual relationship between Jane Grey and the women surrounding Mary Tudor was considerably closer and considerably more uncomfortable than that distant picture allows, since Jane was, in almost every sense, a member of the same narrow world of Tudor court women that Alice Fenwick and her fellow gentlewomen belonged to. A cousin of the Queen by blood. Educated alongside girls of similar rank, and known personally to more than one woman now serving in Mary's own privy chamber. Jane had been Queen of England for 9 days the previous July, installed by a coalition led by her father-in-law, the Duke of Northumberland, in a hurried and ultimately doomed attempt to keep the crown from passing to Mary at all. A scheme Jane herself, by most credible accounts, had neither sought nor particularly wanted. 17-year-old girl of considerable learning and genuine religious conviction, who found herself, largely against her own preference, at the center of a plot orchestrated by the adults around her. Mary's own forces overturned that plot within days, and Jane was imprisoned in the Tower of London that summer, a prisoner of state whose life Mary, notably, chose not to take in the months that followed, despite considerable pressure from advisers who saw an obvious, unresolved threat in keeping a rival claimant alive. For roughly 6 months, from August of 1553 through the following January, Jane remained in the Tower under comfortable, if confined, conditions. And Mary's evident reluctance to execute her cousin was, by the account of most historians who have studied this period closely, a genuine and consistent position, rather than a temporary mercy waiting for a convenient excuse to be withdrawn. Wyatt's rebellion removed that option entirely. Jane's own father, Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, threw his support behind the rebellion in Leicestershire, even as Wyatt marched on London from Kent, and though Jane herself had no documented involvement whatsoever in her father's decision, his participation made her continued survival in the calculation of Mary's counsel. An unacceptable risk that no amount of personal reluctance on the Queen's part could outweigh. Mary signed the execution order, and on the 12th of February 1554, Jane Grey was beheaded privately within the walls of the Tower of London, on Tower Green, rather than the more public execution ground on Tower Hill, a distinction reserved for prisoners of sufficiently high rank. On the same morning, her young husband, Guilford Dudley, was executed publicly nearby. The anonymous contemporary account known as the Chronicle of Queen Jane and of 2 years of Queen Mary, one of the more detailed surviving records of these exact weeks, describes Jane meeting her death with a composed, deliberate piety that impressed even the officials assigned to witness it, reciting psalms and forgiving her executioner before placing her own head on the block. For the women serving in Mary's household that particular week, the news of Jane's execution arrived not as an abstract political development, but as the death of someone several of them had personally known. A young woman, close in age to many of the Queen's own gentlewomen, raised in the same narrow circuit of great households, tutored in the same languages, and, for one brief and strange summer, addressed as Queen by many of the same courtiers who now served Mary without apparent contradiction. Alice had exchanged only a handful of polite words with Jane over the years, at gatherings where the younger daughters of prominent families were expected to make a good impression on each other. But the fact of having stood in the same room as a girl now dead by royal order, private heaviness that nobody discussed openly. What unsettled Alice most in the days that followed was not simply the fact of the execution, but the specific lesson it seemed to teach about the limits of royal mercy, since Mary had shown Jane genuine clemency for half a year, only to have that mercy overridden entirely by a political crisis. The broader context surrounding Mary's decision matters enormously for understanding her as something other than the flattened, vindictive caricature later centuries built around her. The historian Eric Ives, whose study of Jane Grey remains among the most thorough accounts of these events, has argued that Mary's initial reluctance to execute her cousin reflected authentic personal feeling rather than political calculation, and that the eventual execution came only once Wyatt's rebellion made Jane's continued survival politically untenable in the eyes of a council visibly fearful of a second uprising organized around her name. Leander de Lisle, in her History of the Grey Sisters and Their Entangled Claim to the Throne, has made a similar case, framing Jane's death less as evidence of Mary's cruelty and more as a stark illustration of how little control any individual, queen included, actually held over the machinery of dynastic survival once rebellion had entered the equation. Mary, by this account, was not choosing between mercy and cruelty in any simple sense. She was choosing, under enormous pressure from advisers who had just watched an armed rebellion nearly reach her own gates, between one specific young woman's life and what her counsel insisted was the ongoing security, a choice that offers no clean moral resolution, regardless of which side of it a modern viewer finds themselves sympathizing with. There is a quiet observation worth carrying forward from this particular week into everything that came after it for the women in Mary's own household. Jane Grey's execution taught every gentlewoman standing near that news a lesson considerably sharper than any abstract warning about court politics could have delivered. Royal favor, even genuine, sustained, months-long royal favor of the kind Mary had shown her own cousin, could still be overridden entirely by forces outside any individual's control, and a woman's proximity to the throne, however close, offered no reliable promise that closeness would still matter if the political ground shifted again. It was a lesson every woman in that chamber would carry quietly with her for the remainder of Mary's reign, whether or not she ever spoke it aloud. If you picture the spies and informants that filled the Tudor court, you probably picture men, ambassadors trading secrets over dinner, councillors passing folded letters to paid agents, the entire machinery of political information gathering conducted almost exclusively among men with official titles and diplomatic credentials. The actual machinery of information at Mary's court ran just as heavily through the women who dressed her, sat with her, and slept within a few feet of her most private conversations, and understanding that reality changes considerably how the calculated silence practiced by gentlewomen like Alice Fenwick ought to be read, not as a passive survival trait, but as an active, constantly exercised skill. Foreign ambassadors stationed in London during this period, most notably the Imperial Ambassador Simon Reynard, whose detailed dispatches back to the court of Charles V remain one of the richest surviving sources for understanding Mary's reign, relied heavily on informants placed within or connected to the Queen's own household to report on her health, her moods, the private progress of her marriage negotiations, and eventually the increasingly troubling question of whether her pregnancy was progressing as everyone hoped. These informants were not always great officials with formal diplomatic standing. They were frequently minor court servants, family connections of gentlewomen already inside the household, or the gentlewomen themselves, approached quietly, sometimes through a relative, sometimes through a gift or a promised favor, and asked to share details that would have seemed, to the woman asked, like harmless court gossip rather than the intelligence gathering it actually represented. A queen's true state of health, her true feelings about her husband's frequent absences, her genuine private reaction to news from the rebellion or the pregnancy that failed to arrive. All of this carried real diplomatic value to a Spanish court anxiously monitoring the stability of its new English alliance. And every woman close enough to Mary to observe these details firsthand became, whether she sought the position or not, a potential source. For Alice, the pressure to share what she observed arrived not as a dramatic recruitment scene, but as a series of small, almost remarkable, social moments that only became recognizable as pressure once she had learned to notice the pattern. A distant cousin connected loosely to a household with its own factional interests, once asked her, over what appeared to be an entirely ordinary family visit, whether the Queen seemed in good spirits lately, whether the physicians visited often, whether there was talk among the ladies about when the happy event might finally arrive. Alice had learned, by that point in her service, exactly how to answer such questions without actually answering them, offering warm, entirely truthful, and entirely useless observations about the weather affecting the Queen's mood or the general business of a busy court. Her skill, Susan Clerenger had first modelled for her years earlier, and that Alice had since practiced so thoroughly it no longer required conscious effort. Say little. Notice everything. The advice Glazier had given her during her very first winter in service turned out to apply just as directly to a cousin's careful questions over supper it had to a chapel full of watching eyes. The broader context surrounding this quiet, constant management of information reveals something important about the actual political agency women held at this court. An agency easy to overlook if political power is measured only by formal titles. Historians studying the political lives of Tudor gentlewomen, among them Barbara Harris, whose research on aristocratic women of this period has done much to correct the assumption that court women were purely decorative or purely passive, have argued that women occupying positions like Alice's exercised real, if largely invisible, political influence through exactly this kind of careful information management, protecting their own family's interests, managing which details reached which ears, and quietly shaping the flow of court knowledge in ways that rarely appear in the official record, precisely because they were never meant to. A woman's father, brothers, or husband could rise or fall based on how skillfully she navigated these constant, low-grade demands for information, which meant that Alice's careful non-answers to her cousin's questions, they were an act of active protection extended to her entire family's fortunes, performed under exactly the kind of patriarchal pressure that expected women to manage political risk without ever being credited for doing so. There is a quiet observation worth carrying forward from this particular skill into everything else this hour has already described about Alice's daily life at court. The single most valuable ability any woman in Mary's household could cultivate was not courage in any dramatic sense, not the kind of visible bravery a chronicler might record for posterity, but a sustained, exhausting, entirely unglamorous discipline of noticing everything while appearing to notice nothing. Remaining perfectly present in a room while giving away nothing that room contained. It required more constant effort than almost any other demand this hour has described, precisely because it could never be set down even for a moment, not during a family visit, not during an idle conversation with a fellow gentlewoman, not even on the most difficult days during her own quiet prayers, since a woman who had trained herself this thoroughly to reveal nothing sometimes found it difficult to know, in the privacy of her own mind, exactly what she still permitted herself to feel. If you picture the end of a political crisis like Wyatt's rebellion, you probably picture something close to relief, a household exhaling collectively once the immediate danger has passed, returning within a matter of days to whatever ordinary rhythm existed before the emergency began. The women who actually lived through the aftermath of that rebellion experienced nothing resembling a clean, restorative return to normal. What they experienced instead was a long, slow-burning vigilance that simply never fully switched off, stretching across the remainder of that year and well into the next, reshaping the household's daily rhythm in ways that outlasted the specific danger that had first produced it. Prayer had always structured the Queen's private hours, but during the anxious months following the rebellion, and again during the long, uncertain stretch of her supposed pregnancy the following year, the household's devotions took on a considerably heavier, more sustained character. Mary was, by every surviving account, a woman of deep and genuine personal piety, someone who found real comfort in the ritual of the Mass and in private prayer conducted in her own chamber, and during the periods of greatest strain that piety intensified into extended vigils, the Queen kneeling before her own private altar with 2 or 3 of her closest gentlewomen kneeling silently behind her, sharing in a devotion that was for Mary entirely sincere, and that was for at least some of the women sharing it with her, a considerably more complicated experience to sit inside honestly. Alice found herself, more than once that year, kneeling on a cold floor for the better part of an hour, beside a Queen praying with visible unguarded emotion for a healthy child, a resolved succession, and the security of the faith she had spent her entire adult life fighting to restore, while privately holding her own more ordinary, more immediate hopes. That her own family in Yorkshire remained safe, that her own position at court remained secure, that whatever the coming months held would not require of her more than she had already given. These extended vigils were physically demanding in ways nobody at court would have thought to describe as hardship, since kneeling in prayer alongside one's sovereign was by any measure this era recognized an honor rather than a burden. Yet the honor came with a genuine physical cost that the women performing it simply absorbed without comment. Hold stone floors, joints stiffening through an hour or more of stillness, the particular fatigue of maintaining a posture of visible devotion while truly exhausted from a day that had already begun well before dawn. Alice learned, over the course of that year, exactly how to kneel in a way that distributed her weight to minimize strain, exactly which portion of the chamber floor carried the least draft, small adaptations that no one taught her directly, but that every gentlewoman in that household eventually discovered on her own. The same way a body learns to manage any sustained physical demand it cannot avoid. The broader context surrounding this sustained vigilance helps explain why historians studying Mary's reign increasingly emphasize endurance rather than any single dramatic event as the defining experience of court service during these years. Susan Clarengeau's own 3 decades of continuous service to Mary, spanning disgrace, disinheritance, restoration, rebellion, and the Queen's own physical and emotional unraveling during the false pregnancy, stands as perhaps the clearest example of what this endurance actually required. A loyalty sustained, not through any single act of heroism, but through the accumulated weight of thousands of small, unremarkable days spent managing a difficult, frightened, deeply devout woman's private needs. Jane Dormer, whose later recollections of her years in Mary's household were eventually recorded by the chaplain who compiled her biography decades after these events, described her mistress in terms of genuine warmth and personal devotion. Devotion that historians now read as entirely consistent with the private woman glimpsed elsewhere in the historical record. Someone capable of real tenderness toward the women who served her, even while presiding at the level of state policy, over decisions that would eventually cost hundreds of her subjects their lives. There is a quiet observation worth carrying forward from this long, unglamorous vigilance into everything else this hour has already walked through. By the time this particular dangerous year had finally worn itself out, the women who had kept vigil beside Mary Tudor through all of it, the rebellion, the executions, the religious suspicion, the hope and eventual heartbreak of a pregnancy that never resolved into a living child, had learned a lesson no single dramatic event, on its own, could have taught them nearly as thoroughly. Survival at this court was not a matter of surviving one crisis and then resting. It was a matter of learning to carry an unbroken, quietly exhausting watchfulness through every single day that followed, for as long as proximity to the crown required it of them, with no fixed point at which anyone was ever told the vigilance could finally, safely stop. If you picture a royal wedding of this era, you probably picture something close to unambiguous celebration, a kingdom uniting joyfully behind its queen's happiness, bells ringing across a country grateful to see its monarch settled. The wedding that actually took place at Winchester Cathedral, 25th of July, 1554, deliberately chosen for the feast day of St. James, patron saint of Spain, carried almost none of that uncomplicated goodwill, and the household preparing for it, Alice Fenwick among them, understood perfectly well that they were staging a celebration a considerable portion of the country actively resented. Philip of Spain landed at Southampton just days before the ceremony, arriving with a retinue large enough to strain the logistics of every household along his route, and the marriage he came to complete was, by that point, the same marriage that had driven several thousand armed men to march on London only months earlier. Parliament had spent considerable effort that spring negotiating exactly how much power this foreign prince would actually hold once he became, in name, King of England, and the resulting marriage treaty, which historians, including David Lloyd's, have examined closely as a genuine attempt to manage England's very real fear of Spanish domination, restricted Philip's authority with unusual specificity. He would hold the royal title only during Mary's lifetime, with no independent claim to the throne should she predecease him without an heir. He could not appoint Spaniards to English offices. England would not be drawn into Spain's ongoing wars on the continent as a result of the match. Every clause represented a concession wrung from a match the English political class had accepted only reluctantly, and every English subject who had watched Wyatt's rebels march toward London that winter understood exactly why those restrictions had been considered necessary in the first place. The logistical burden this placed on Mary's household in the weeks surrounding the wedding was considerable, and it fell, as most such burdens did, most heavily on the women managing the Queen's daily life. Philip's retinue included hundreds of Spanish courtiers, servants, and officials, all of whom required lodging, feeding, some working accommodation with English household protocol they found unfamiliar and in more than one recorded instance openly disdained, while English servants displaced to make room for them nursed grievances of their own that occasionally spilled into open friction between the two households. Alice found herself, in the days surrounding the wedding, coordinating constantly with Spanish attendants whose language she did not speak beyond a handful of courtly phrases, relying on the small amount of French common to educated households on both sides of the arrangement, and adjusting again and again to protocols and expectations that shifted, depending on which household's officials happened to be issuing instructions that particular morning. Mary herself, by most accounts, communicated with her new husband in a halting mixture of Spanish, French, and Latin, since neither spoke the other's native tongue with any real fluency. A detail that meant even the Queen's own private conversations with her husband required a kind of constant, careful translation that Alice and the other gentlewomen closest to her could sense, if not always follow precisely, during the couple's early months together. Popular resentment of the marriage did not evaporate once the ceremony was complete. Ballads and pamphlets circulating in London that year, several of which survive in later collections of period literature, expressed open hostility toward the proud, foreign Spaniards now crowding England's court and countryside, and English crowds occasionally jeered at Spanish courtiers in the street. Incidents serious enough that Philip's own advisers urged him toward visible restraint and generosity in public, hoping to soften an unpopularity that no marriage treaty, however carefully worded, could fully dissolve. For the women inside Mary's household, this lingering hostility meant that even the wedding itself, an occasion that ought to have offered a rare, uncomplicated celebration after a bitterly difficult winter, arrived wrapped in its own quiet undercurrent of danger, since a household now visibly associated with a deeply unpopular foreign marriage remained, in its own way, just as exposed to public anger as it had been during the rebellion itself. The broader context surrounding this uneasy union reveals just how thoroughly political calculation had displaced ordinary domestic happiness from even the most personal moments of Mary's life. The historian Anna Whitelock has described the early months of Mary's marriage as a period of genuine, if cautious, personal happiness for the Queen herself, who appears by several accounts to have developed real affection for her new husband. Even as Philip's own attention remained divided between his new English wife and the vast continental empire he stood to inherit from his father, an empire that would, within a matter of months, begin pulling him back toward the affairs of Spain and the Low Countries. There is a quiet observation worth carrying forward from this strange, politically fraught wedding into everything else this hour has already described about the women who staffed Mary's household. Even the occasion built specifically to represent joy, security, and the promise of a settled succession required the same invisible, exhausting labor as every crisis that had come before it, coordinated across a language barrier, staged in the shadow of a rebellion, and shadowed by a popular resentment that never fully faded, no matter how carefully the ceremony itself was arranged. For Alice and her fellow gentlewomen, there was no clean line separating celebration from vigilance. There was only the same steady, watchful labor, dressed, on this particular occasion, in considerably finer cloth than usual. If you picture the women of Mary Tudor's household during the years the burnings began, you probably picture uniform, unquestioning zealotry, a chamber full of women entirely comfortable with the persecution unfolding beyond the palace walls, their devotion to the restored Catholic faith leaving no room whatsoever for private discomfort. The actual emotional reality inside that household, insofar as fragments of it can be reconstructed from the surviving record, and from what historians now understand about the wider range of belief circulating at any Tudor court, was almost certainly considerably less uniform than that comfortable caricature allows. The first burning took place on the 4th of February 1555, when the clergyman John Rogers was executed at Smithfield, the opening act in a campaign that would eventually claim close to 280 lives across the remaining 3 years of Mary's reign. Shaped decisively by John Fox's widely read Actes and Monuments, would fix permanently onto Mary's own name. What that fixed, simplified memory tends to obscure is the genuine theological conviction driving the policy from Mary's own perspective and from that of her closest religious advisor, Cardinal Reginald Pole, both of whom understood themselves to be saving souls, a distinction that mattered enormously within the moral framework of their own century, even if it offers little comfort by modern standards. The historian Eamon Duffy has argued persuasively that burning heretics was, in 1555, an entirely conventional instrument of state religious policy practiced across Catholic and Protestant Europe alike, not some uniquely English or uniquely Marian invention, and that what actually distinguished Mary's reign was less the method itself than the unusually concentrated scale of its application within a comparatively short span of years, a concentration that had everything to do with cementing the specific, lasting reputation history for the women inside Mary's own household. This widening campaign arrived as something considerably more complicated than distant policy. News of specific burnings traveled quickly through court gossip, since Smithfield sat close enough to the palace that details of a particular execution, who had been burned, how the crowd had reacted, whether the condemned had recanted or held firm to the end, became common knowledge within the Privy Chamber within a day or two of each event. Alice, whose own private anxiety about her younger brother's earlier education under a reformist tutor had never fully settled since the tense weeks of Wyatt's rebellion, found this period considerably harder to sit inside quietly than the acute, adrenaline-sharp fear of the rebellion itself had been, since that earlier danger had at least offered a clear, immediate threat to respond to, while this newer unease required nothing but continued ordinary service, performed alongside a growing awareness of exactly what her Queen's government was now doing to people whose private beliefs, only a few years earlier, under Mary's own brother, had been the officially sanctioned faith of the entire kingdom. The household absorbed at least one small unspoken casualty of this widening suspicion that Alice witnessed directly. A young chamberer, a servant of lower rank than Alice herself, was quietly dismissed from service that spring after a household official discovered, during an otherwise unremarkable search of the servants' quarters for an unrelated matter, a small printed primer in the reformed English tongue tucked among her few possessions. No formal charge followed, no dramatic arrest. Simply a quiet word from the mistress of the household, and a swift, unexplained departure that the remaining servants understood perfectly well, without anyone needing to spell out the reason aloud. Alice had barely known the young woman beyond a shared task now and again, but the departure unsettled her considerably more than a more dramatic punishment might have, precisely because of how quietly it happened, how easily an entire life at court could be unraveled by a single object discovered during an unrelated search. No public reckoning, simply a door closing behind someone who, the day before, had been an unremarkable part of the household's daily rhythm. What made this period so difficult to navigate, in a way the earlier rebellion had not quite been, was the specific demand it placed on every woman in that household to hold two entirely separate things inside herself simultaneously, without ever allowing either one to show plainly on her face. Public loyalty to the Queen, to the restored faith, had to remain complete and visible at every moment, in every gesture at Mass, in every conversation where the topic of religion might arise, even glancingly, while whatever private discomfort or grief a woman actually felt about the mounting toll of executions had to be managed entirely internally, confided to no one, expressed nowhere, carried alone. The historian Judith Richards has argued that this precise tension between institutional loyalty and private conscience defined the moral experience of court service under Mary considerably more accurately than any simple narrative of either devoted zealotry or secret resistance. Were neither wholehearted believers in every aspect of the policy nor covert opponents of it, but ordinary people managing an impossible moral position with whatever quiet compromises kept them and their families safe. There is a quiet observation worth carrying forward from this particular difficult stretch of the household's life into everything else this hour has already described. The women serving Mary Tudor were never required to resolve, even in their own private thoughts, the tension between what their queen's government was doing and what their own conscience might have quietly told them about it. They were required only to survive inside that tension indefinitely, without ever letting anyone around them see exactly where their own private feelings actually settled. It was, in its own understated way, among the heaviest burdens this entire dangerous period placed on them, heavier, in some respects, than the acute terror of an army at the gates, because it never fully lifted, and because no single moment of relief or resolution ever arrived to mark its end. If you picture a 16th century royal marriage settling, after its politically fraught beginning, into a steady, supportive partnership, a foreign prince remaining faithfully at his new wife's side through whatever difficulty the marriage's early months had already produced, you are picturing something considerably more stable than what Alice Fenwick and the rest of Mary's household actually watched unfold across the following year. By the late summer of 1555, only weeks after the Queen's supposed pregnancy had finally, humiliatingly, revealed itself as no pregnancy at all, Philip left England for the Low Countries. Called away by the vast tangle of Habsburg dynastic obligations, his father Charles V was in the process of unwinding through a staggered series of abdications that would eventually hand Philip control of Spain, the Netherlands, and a substantial portion of Europe's most contested territory. The timing could hardly have landed at a more painful moment for Mary personally. She had spent the spring and early summer of 1555 at Hampton Court, increasingly isolated from public view as her supposed confinement stretched weeks and then months past any plausible due date. And by the time the pregnancy's failure had become undeniable, even to the Queen herself, she was left facing that private catastrophe with a husband already turning his attention toward the continental affairs that would, within a matter of weeks, carry him away from England entirely. Contemporary accounts, along with the analysis of historians including Anna Whitelock, describe Mary's reaction to Philip's departure as genuine, visible heartbreak. Rather than the composed acceptance a queen of her position might have been expected to project, letters written in her own hand pleading for his early return, and a household left to manage a sovereign whose private grief was, for the first time this entire dangerous period, not fear of rebellion or execution, but something closer to ordinary, universal loneliness. For Alice and the other gentlewomen closest to the Queen, this new emotional register required an entirely different set of skills than anything the rebellion or the phantom pregnancy had demanded of them. The acute crisis of Wyatt's march on London had called for calm, steady competence in the face of immediate danger. The slow unraveling of the false pregnancy had called for a kind of careful, compassionate silence around a subject nobody dared name directly. Philip's departure called for something quieter still, the patient, unglamorous work of simply keeping a grieving woman company through the long stretches of an evening when her husband's absence pressed hardest, reading to her, sitting near her at her needlework, filling the silence of a chamber that had, for one all too brief a season, the previous year, held the ordinary warmth of a new marriage, and now held only the Queen's own restless waiting. Alice recalled in later years evenings spent watching Mary stand near a window in the fading light, with a letter from Philip held in her hands, reading it through more than once, searching each fresh dispatch for some sign that his return might come sooner than his own itinerary suggested, and the particular private sorrow of watching a woman who had once stood before an entire hostile crowd at the Guildhall and commanded their loyalty through sheer force of will, now made small and uncertain by an absence she had no real power to shorten. The broader context surrounding Philip's extended absence, which would eventually stretch well past a year before a brief return in 1557, pulled largely by his own strategic interest in drawing England into a war against France, reveals something important about the actual limits of even a queen's authority once it collided with the wider machinery of European dynastic politics. Historians including David Loades have noted that Mary's marriage, for all the enormous political calculation invested in arranging it, never fully overcame the basic imbalance built into its foundation, a queen regnant whose own kingdom remained, in Philip's own strategic thinking, a secondary and often inconvenient commitment measured against the vastly larger inheritance he stood to receive from his father across Spain and the Low Countries. Mary's physical and emotional health, already fragile from decades of documented headaches, irregular cycles, and periods of melancholy, absorbed the full weight of this imbalance without any of the political leverage that might have compelled a different arrangement. And the women serving in her household absorbed a considerable portion of that weight alongside her, since a queen too heartsick to manage her own correspondence, or too fatigued by grief to sit for the hours a formal audience required, still needed dressing, still needed her chamber managed, still needed the same careful, showy attention every other crisis this hour has described had already demanded of the women around her. There is a quiet observation worth carrying forward from this long, quiet season of absence into everything else this hour has already walked through together. The rebellion had taught the household how to manage acute, shared terror. The phantom pregnancy had taught them how to manage collective, unspoken disappointment. Philip's departure taught them something considerably more universal, and in its own way, more difficult to sit inside professionally, how to attend to an entirely ordinary human loneliness, dressed in the clothing of a queen, a sorrow no different in its essential shape from grief felt in any household across England that same year, except that this particular grief had to be managed with the same composed, unreadable calm every other crisis of this dangerous period had already required in a chamber where even heartbreak was in its own quiet way. Step back now from the individual chapters of this particular dangerous year, and a handful of larger patterns come into view. Patterns that connect Alice Fenwick's aching back on a trundle bed to Jane Grey's composed final prayers on Tower Green. Patterns that say something considerably larger about this specific court. About the nature of proximity to power in any era. The first pattern concerns the true cost of what looked, from any outside vantage point, like ease. A gentlewoman of the Privy Chamber occupied a position most people in 16th century England would have considered enviable, almost beyond imagining. Fine clothing, proximity to the most powerful woman in the kingdom, freedom from the physical labor that defined life for the vast majority of English women. And yet the actual daily experience of that position, examined closely, reveals something closer to continuous, unrelenting labor than to any recognizable form of leisure. Nights fractured by duty on a hard trundle bed, mornings consumed by hours of exacting physical work dressing a body not one's own. Watchful attentiveness that never fully switched off. Rest, in this household, was not something a woman's rank simply granted her. It was a resource distributed according to an entirely different calculation, one that had almost nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with how completely a woman's body and attention belonged to someone else's needs. The second pattern concerns the specific, repeated lesson that closeness to the throne offered no reliable protection from the throne's own dangers, and, in some circumstances, actively increased a woman's exposure to them. Jane Grey's execution taught this lesson at its starkest. A young woman who had once been queen herself, related by blood to the woman who ultimately signed her death warrant, found no safety whatsoever in that closeness. Princess Elizabeth's arrest taught the same lesson from a different angle. A queen's own sister summoned, questioned, and imprisoned on evidence historians now generally regard as remarkably thin. For gentlewomen like Alice, considerably further from the throne than either of these two royal women, the lesson translated into a specific, practical discipline, an understanding that whatever loyalty, service she offered, the queen bought her proximity, certainty, and perhaps even genuine affection. The third pattern concerns the way this era's politics ran directly through actual physical bodies, rather than remaining safely abstract. Mary's own headaches, her irregular cycles, her eventual phantom pregnancy. None of these were private medical matters in any sense a modern person would recognize. They were matters of state, tracked by foreign ambassadors, discussed in diplomatic dispatches, capable of reshaping the entire course of English and European politics, depending on which direction they happened to resolve. And the same principle, at a smaller scale, governed the bodies of the women serving her, a gentlewoman's composed face during Mass, her steady hands while pinning a royal sleeve into place, her careful, silent kneeling through an hour-long vigil, all of it performance conducted through the body, all of it carrying real political weight, even though none of it would ever appear in a single official record of the reign. The fourth pattern, and perhaps the one most worth sitting with before this hour draws to its close, concerns the specific skill this court demanded above every other, the art of remaining genuinely unremarkable while standing at the exact center of the most closely watched household in England. It was not passivity, it required constant, exhausting effort, precisely calibrated silence, carefully managed information, a face trained to reveal nothing, regardless of what its owner actually felt underneath. Susan Clarencieux mastered it across 3 decades. Jane Dormer mastered it well enough to later recount her years of service with evident warmth rather than resentment. Alice Fenwick mastered it well enough to survive a year that claimed the life of a former queen, sent a princess to the Tower, and quietly ended the household position of at least one servant discovered with the wrong book hidden among her belongings. There is a 5th pattern worth naming here, quieter than the other 4 and considerably harder to document from the surviving record, since it left behind almost no trace in the official papers historians usually rely on. Women at this court did not simply endure their circumstances in isolation from one another. They built, in the small margins left available to them, a working system of mutual support that functioned as a genuine counterweight to the constant surveillance this hour has already described, even if nobody involved would have used a term so formal to describe it. Susan Clarencieux's early guidance to Alice, offered during her very first winter in service, was itself an act of this kind. An older woman spending her own limited time and credibility. Gentlewomen covered for each other's exhaustion, taking an extra night of duty without complaint when a colleague was visibly struggling, offering a quiet word of reassurance before a difficult audience, sharing whatever small comforts a household under strain could still produce, a warmed brick for a cold trundle bed, or private moment to simply sit together in silence after a particularly hard day. The historian Barbara Harris, whose work on the political lives of aristocratic Tudor women has already informed how this hour understands Alice's careful management of information, has argued that these informal networks of female support functioned as a genuine, if entirely undocumented, form of political and emotional infrastructure. Allowing women excluded from every formal channel of power to nonetheless share knowledge, distribute risk, and simply survive a system that gave them very little institutional protection of their own. It is worth resisting, in light of this pattern, any account of Mary's court that reduces the women inside it to isolated, competing individuals, each managing her own survival in total solitude. They were doing that, certainly, but they were also, in whatever quiet ways the record allows us to glimpse, doing it together. None of this is offered as a verdict on Mary Tudor herself, whose own reputation history flattened in the decades after her death into a single word that erases considerably more than it explains. She was neither the simple tyrant later Protestant memory preferred, nor a blameless victim of circumstance. She was a woman managing an impossible position, a disputed throne, a body that repeatedly betrayed her hopes, a marriage that offered political security at the cost of genuine personal loneliness, and a religious conviction she held with total sincerity even as its consequences in the final years of her reign grew considerably darker than anything in this particular year had yet suggested. The women who served her navigated an equally impossible position alongside her, without a fraction of her formal power, and with every bit of the same exposure to the era's violence and uncertainty. Their survival deserves to be understood on its own difficult terms, not filtered through whatever simplified judgment history eventually settled on the queen they served. Return, for a moment, to the room this hour opened inside. The closing weeks of 1554, a painter named Antonis Moore working steadily by the window light, while Mary Tudor holds herself perfectly still in a chair a few feet away, dressed in velvet so dark it reads almost black, jewels catching what light reaches them. Her hands folded around a pair of gloves and a small book, her face composed into the unblinking calm that would travel, within that same portrait, all the way to a husband who had already returned to the business of an empire considerably larger than the one small island kingdom he had married into. It looked at the start of this hour like a portrait of total, settled authority. A queen secure enough in her throne to sit for an hour without complaint, while a stranger studied her face closely enough to render it in oil and lead white. You know now what that stillness actually cost and who else was standing in that same chamber to help produce it. You know, Alice Fenwick, 23 years old that winter, a minor Yorkshire knight's daughter, who had already spent years learning the rules of survival at a court that offered her proximity to a queen and almost nothing resembling genuine safety in exchange for it. You know that Alice slept most nights of that year on a narrow trundle bed pulled from beneath the Queen's own bedstead, waking at the smallest change in Mary's breathing, absorbing a cold that the Queen's own heavier bedding never quite let through to her. You know that dressing this Queen for a portrait, like the one Antonis Moore painted, required the hands of 3 or 4 gentlewomen working in careful, practiced coordination for the better part of 2 hours, pinning sleeves fresh each morning, lacing a boned bodice tight enough to hold its shape through a full day of business, threading jewels into fabric while the Queen herself, more than once that year, read troubling dispatches from the middle of the process, her face working to stay composed for the benefit of the very women helping to compose it. You know that some of those same women reached, on the coldest, greyest mornings of that winter, for a small pot of imported white lead, dabbing Venetian ceruse along a jaw gone sallow from months indoors, not from vanity in any simple sense, but from a brutal calculation about how a woman's future depended on how her face read to the people who controlled it, never fully understanding that the very substance disguising one blemish was quietly manufacturing another, slower one underneath. You know that the winter this portrait story actually begins in was a winter of armed rebellion, several thousand men marching on London under Sir Thomas Wyatt's banner, a queen who rode into her own capital against her council's frightened advice and won its loyalty through nothing but her own presence and her own carefully chosen words at the Guildhall. You know that the household absorbing all of this held its collective breath through days of contradictory reports arriving by exhausted messenger, gates more heavily guarded than anyone at court had ever seen them, small valuables quietly gathered against the possibility of a sudden, desperate flight. You know, too, what this same household watched in the weeks that followed the rebellion's collapse. A young woman named Jane Grey, queen for 9 strange days the previous summer, cousin to Mary by blood, and known personally to more than one gentlewoman in that chamber, put to death on Tower Green once her father's involvement in Wyatt's rebellion made her continued survival a risk Mary's council would no longer tolerate, despite 6 months of the Queen's own genuine, documented reluctance to take that particular life. You know that Princess Elizabeth herself was sent to the Tower within weeks of that execution, on evidence historians now regard as remarkably thin, a fact that told every woman in Mary's own household, in terms nobody needed to spell out loud, exactly how far this atmosphere of suspicion could reach regardless of blood or rank. You know that faith itself in this household had become a constant public performance, watched at every mass for the smallest telling gesture, while women like Alice kept whatever remained of their own family's more complicated religious history hidden beneath loose floorboards. You know that Mary's own body carried the weight of an entire dynasty's hopes and failed to deliver what everyone around her had prayed for, a pregnancy that consumed the better part of a year before revealing itself as no pregnancy at all, and that the women closest to her absorbed a portion of that grief alongside her own, without any acknowledgement that their private sorrow on the Queen's behalf was itself a real weight worth naming. You know that her marriage, arranged at enormous political cost and hedged with restrictions Parliament had insisted upon to protect English sovereignty from Spanish ambition, gave her a husband who left for the continent within a year, called away by an inheritance considerably larger than the one small kingdom he had married into, leaving Mary to stand at a window some evenings with his letters in her hands, searching each one for a sign of an earlier return that did not come. There is one further loyalty worth naming before this portrait's frame closes for good, owed this time not to the composite thread this hour has followed, but to the real documented women whose lives shaped her. Susan Clarence Shaw remained at Mary's side for the rest of the Queen's life, through every reversal this hour has already described, and beyond, present at Mary's death in November of 1558, and named an executor of the Queen's own will, a final, formal acknowledgement of more than 3 decades of unbroken service that had begun when Mary herself was still a disinherited young woman, with no throne in sight. Jane Dormer's path led further still. She married the Spanish Count of Feria the same year Mary died, left England for Spain not long afterward, and lived into her 90s, long enough that her own recollections of these exact years dictated late in her life to the chaplain who preserved them. Remain one of the few surviving accounts of Mary's private household written by a woman who had actually stood inside it. Alice Fenwick did not exist under that exact name. She stands, in this telling, for every gentlewoman whose own service left no comparable trace, no will naming her as executor, no chaplain recording her memories decades later. Women whose names survive, if they survive at all. Known only in the scattered household accounts and wardrobe warrants that historians now comb through, precisely to recover lives like hers. None of this was visible in the finished portrait Antonis More delivered to Spain that winter. None of it needed to be. A portrait's entire purpose was to show what a court had agreed the world outside its walls should be permitted to see, and by every available measure, this particular portrait succeeded completely at the narrow task it was built for. Mary Tudor looks in that finished painting exactly like what her council and her new husband's father wanted the rest of Europe to believe about the state of the English throne: settled, composed. She was not, despite everything this hour has described. She was, in the middle of all of it, still recognizably herself, a woman of genuine piety and genuine warmth toward the people who served her closely, managing a body that would not cooperate with her hopes, a marriage that could not hold her husband's full attention, and a kingdom that had tried, within the first 18 months of her reign, to remove her from her own throne by force. And the women who dressed her, prayed beside her, guarded her secrets, and in Alice Fenwick's case, learned to hold an entire year of terror, grief, and quiet vigilance behind a perfectly unremarkable face, deserved to be seen just as clearly as the Queen they served, not as background figures standing patiently at the edge of someone else's portrait, but as women who mastered, out of sheer necessity, the most demanding art their century had to offer, the art of remaining completely invisible while standing at the exact center of power. It would be easy enough to close this hour with a simple verdict on the Queen at the center of it. Easy to reach for the same flattened word history has already settled on her, or to swing just as hard in the opposite direction and insist she deserves nothing but sympathy. Neither reading survives close contact with the actual women who lived inside her household that year. Mary Tudor governed a policy that would go on to burn nearly 300 people for their beliefs, and she also spent 6 months resisting her own council's pressure to execute a cousin who plainly did not wish to see dead, wept openly over a marriage that left her lonelier than any portrait would ever admit, on more than one gentlewoman who never had any political reason to invent the feeling, something that reads in the fragments the record preserves, like genuine personal devotion. Holding a hard, unflattering political record and a private, complicated human being in the same frame is considerably more difficult than choosing one story and discarding the other, and it is exactly the discipline this hour has tried to practice for the Queen and for the women who served her. The candles in that painter's chamber have burned down long since, wherever this hour has actually left them. The portrait itself still hangs in Madrid, in a gallery. Most of its visitors will walk past without knowing a single one of these names. But you know them now. Alice Fenwick and Susan Claringer and Jane Dormer and the Queen, they all served through the most dangerous winter of her reign, and you know what the stillness in that finished painting was actually built from. Sleep well tonight, in whatever quieter century you happen to be sitting in, and spare a thought, if you can, for the women who never once appear in the frame, and who made everything inside it possible.